I'm Jake Seepers, and today I will be taking you through an introductory lesson on conifer ID. ID is a very difficult subject when you look around and you see so many trees. In this video, I'm going to show you just the conifers, so we start off nice and simple. More specifically, I'm going to be going into the native conifers of southern Ontario. First off, we got to introduce the different needle types. So that's singly borne, clustered needles, and scale and awl-like needles. Let's jump right into it. So first off, we have the singly borne needles group. If we find a twig that's singly borne, basically what we're saying is that each individual needle here, as you can see, has its own separate attachment point. See that all over? And usually when we have a singly borne species of conifer, we can infer that it's either a spruce tree or maybe a fir tree. So next off, we have the clustered needles group, and essentially what we have here is a bunch of little clusters, as I just said, of needles, usually in groups of 5, 3, or 2. This one's really easy because essentially what this tells us is that what we're looking at is a pine tree. So lastly, we have the scale and awl-like needles. So when we get up close here, this is more of a scale-like, and basically it just looks like scales on a fish overlapping the needle. Now you'll see this on an eastern white cedar or a juniper. And then awl-like, if we get closer in here, there's little spiky bits, that brown bit there. Now, with a lot of juniper species, there's kind of a mix of scale and awl-like needles. So our first singly borne species is the white spruce. This is one of the most common species in Canada, and as you can see from the form, it has the pyramidal look to it still, but it's still a little bit more rounded on the top rather than pointy as some other conifers might look. So now we have the white spruce needles, as you can see, and they have sharp tips here. They're singly borne, and they actually have a bluish to greenish white film on the needles. The cones on the white spruce are brown, cylindrical, and slender. You can find them all over the tree. So the next specimen is the black spruce. And if we take a look at the form of the black spruce, you'll notice that it's a lot less tidy than maybe some other conifers, a little ragged looking almost. At the top of the crown, you'll notice that there's a bunch of clustered small cones. And this tree, typically you'll see a lot less than you would the white spruce. It's a bit more rare. So with the black spruce needles, we have singly borne again, just like any other spruce. The needles here are significantly shorter than any other spruce needle that you're going to find. And another thing too is there's these little terminal buds on the ends of the twigs there. If you have a hand lens, you can actually see little hairs on them. And at the top here as well, we have clusters of these very small egg-shaped cones. So next up, we have a balsam fir here, and you'll notice that the top comes to quite a point with the form. And that's something that stands out with these trees, is that they have a very triangular or pyramidal form, unlike, even the white spruce or the black spruce. So we have singly borne needles here again. The only difference with the needles on the balsam fir, though, is that if you look really closely, they're sessile, so they're stalkless. And as you look a little bit closer there, you'll notice it almost looks like tiny little suction cups attached to the twig there. If you're looking at a young balsam fir, another ID feature you can use is with the bark. And if you look here, it'll feel pretty smooth overall, but you'll see those little bumps all over the place. And those are just basically resin blisters. So that can be used as an ID feature as well. So here we have the eastern hemlock. Something to note about the eastern hemlock is the form. Specifically, if you look at the very top, you'll notice the leader actually droops over, almost like the Charlie Brown Christmas tree. That is a good ID feature for this tree. Another thing to note about the eastern hemlock is that a lot of the time they can grow pretty well under shade, as you can see here in this example. So you might be thinking this looks pretty similar to the balsam fir, but if you look closely, these are actually sessile. So they have a little petiole holding the needles onto the branch. Now if you flip that branch over, you'll notice the underside is a nice silver kind of color, and the top side is green, which is another ID feature for the eastern hemlock. So our first clustered needle species is the eastern white pine. And right off the bat, right from the form, you can see that it has a very windswept kind of appearance. It's actually the tallest native tree in eastern North America. But yeah, we go off of that windswept kind of look on form as an ID feature here. So here you'll see plenty of different bundles. And with eastern white pine, it's actually probably one of the easiest to identify because the clusters of needles here are in fives, whereas nothing else you're going to find in southern Ontario has 5 needles. So if you have 5 needles, you have an eastern white pine. Another ID feature worth noting is that the eastern white pine has long, pitch-covered cones. So next we have red pine. There's not a whole lot to be said on form for this one, as a lot of the pines kind of have the exact same looking form. What can be said is that the bark at maturity typically has a very scaly looking appearance with a very reddish undertone. Here, in this video, this specimen that I filmed is a little bit younger. Here's a photo of a more mature one. So here's the needles of the red pine, and you'll notice that they're all in bundles of 2. They're very long looking needles. The tips of them are sharp pointed. Um, a trick with them is that the needles are brittle enough that if you bend them, they should break. Whereas other species that look similar to red pine, like Austrian pine, the needles wouldn't break. So next we have the pitch pine here, and form-wise you'll notice it looks quite similar to the red pine. The pitch pine actually, the natural range is quite small. You see it more around the Kingston area, but there's a distinctive tool you can use to ID this one. So the best tool to use on IDing this one would be the needles. Like the eastern white pine that has 5 needles, the pitch pine has 3. And what's significant about that? Well, no other pine has just a bundle of 3, so use that to ID. Another ID feature you can use for the pitch pine is by looking at bark. So the bark clearly looks quite a bit like the red pine, but you'll see there on the side there's those tufts, or those little explosions of pine needles, and you won't see that on the bark of the red pine, but you will see it on the pitch. So here's our final pine tree. This is the jack pine. You'll notice it has quite a scraggly looking form, and it's actually the inspiration for a lot of Tom Thompson paintings, if you've seen any of those. So with jack pine needles, we have bundles of 2 here, very short needles, and you'll notice they kind of bend and make a V kind of shape. You'll see these throughout. They're almost kind of a yellowish green. So the biggest ID feature I find with the jack pine though is the cones. You'll see them twisting all around the tree throughout, and they've actually probably been on there for a long time. And the reason why is because they're serotinous cones, so they only open up if there's mass heat or fire. So this is our first scale-like specimen, and this is the eastern white cedar. If you go up close to it, it has a very aromatic smell if you crush the leaves. It's usually in an upright tree form. Sometimes it's manicured to look more like a landscape plant. And sometimes you can even find forests that are dominated with just eastern white cedar. So here are the leaves of the eastern white cedar. You look really close in there, you'll notice that there's a bunch of overlapping scales. So that's the scale-like needles there. And if you look a little bit all over the tree, you'll see these little clusters of cones. They're usually in groups of 5 to 6. Mainly the scale-like, the aromatic smell is a good ID feature on these ones. Also, fun fact, this isn't actually a true cedar. So here we have an eastern juniper, which has a very scruffy looking appearance and is also not a true cedar. Many of the junipers look quite the same, and form is one of the best tools we can use to differentiate between the different kinds. So you see here, eastern juniper is like an upright tree, while creeping juniper is a low-lying shrub, and common juniper is an upright bush that has some more height to it than, say, creeping juniper. The needles of the eastern juniper have a mix of scale and awl-like needles. You'll see the overlapping scales throughout, and at the tips of the twigs you'll find more of the spiky awl-like needles. Eastern juniper can also have bluish-white berries throughout. That being said, I find form is the best with the junipers. So for our bonus round, we have the tamarack. And the reason I had this as a bonus is because, I mean, if you just look at it here, you'll notice that it has no needles. The tamarack is actually a deciduous conifer. So essentially that just means every single fall it loses its needles and then it regrows them the next year like any other deciduous tree. So the tamarack's needle type is a little different. On New Year's growth, it is singly borne, so it has an attachment point. But on old growth, it is in tufts or clusters. The clusters are of 30 to 40, so it's a little different. That's why I put it on its own. So one more ID feature to have is that they do have cones. They're very tiny, they're ovoid, and they're around 1 to 2 centimeters in size.
So overall, you've learned that there's a lot to tree ID. There's a lot to learn. And with my video, you can just start with the basics, the native conifers. Other additional resources you can use would be Trees in Canada by John Farrar, or my Quizlet down below in the link, which you can use on your phone offline to practice trees at any point in the day if you'd like to. Overall, I thank you for watching my video, and I hope you learned something. Thank you.